Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Justin Mogilski, and this is Psych 101 Introduction to Psychology. The first thing that I teach any of my students is that when someone gets in front of you and says that they're going to be teaching you something for an extended period of time, you should probably figure out what their credentials are. What qualifies them to lecture to you about this topic? I'm going to give you two lines of evidence. One, I'm a doctor. I've earned a PhD. What that means is I spent a considerable amount of time training in a very particular domain of knowledge. Having a doctorate does not mean that you know everything. In fact, quite the opposite. It makes you keenly aware of what you do not know. There's a vastness to human knowledge, and I only have access, any one of us only has access to a very small sliver of it. Number two, though, what I've done, so I am a professor, I teach, it's something that I enjoy incredibly, but part of my job is not just that I teach, but I have to perform scholarship or original research. To do that, what I do is I actually collect data from people. I formulate hypotheses based on prior theory. I then create surveys, experiments, collect data from people, both in South Carolina and throughout the world, to test those hypotheses, gather data to perform statistical analyses, test the hypotheses, write up the results. I then submit those results to what's called a peer-reviewed journal. And from there, my work gets vetted for quality by my peers. Those of you who are not familiar with what a peer-reviewed journal is, you take the data that you've collected, you submit it somewhere, and these are other people within the field that you've collected this data who are not motivated necessarily to see you publish. They rip apart your methods, they question how you've collected that data, they question how you've interpreted that data, and hopefully after this very long and arduous process, it gets published somewhere. So what I have done is I've collected data, I've tested these kinds of hypotheses for a good long while, and I've published a number of peer-reviewed articles on very broadly relationship science, human mating, the things that people do within romantic, sexual, and intimate relationships. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sampler of where I published and what kinds of topics I have published on. Very broadly, I've looked at things like mate poaching, which is when if you are single, instead of seeking someone who is currently single as well to start a romantic relationship, you go after someone who's currently in a romantic relationship. I've looked at the various reasons that people dissolve their relationships, why people break up. And this is a particular example published back in 2016, titled Staying Friends with an Ex, Sex and Dark Personality Traits Predict Motivations for Post-Relationship Friendship. One of the unique contributions of this particular study is we wanted to know when people break up and then they stay friends with their ex, why do they do it? Prior to this research, there hadn't been really a documented, comprehensive list of reasons that people stayed friends with their exes. So what we did was we asked people, well, why do you stay friends with an ex? We took these many reasons that were ACT nominated to us. We then created a measure that people could fill out where we identified about 7 different reasons. And I want to highlight a couple of them. One, things like reliability and sentimentality. That is, they wanted to stay friends with an ex because they were an important part of the person's life. They had an ongoing friendship together. They were someone who they had shared secrets with, someone who they leaned on for emotional support, and they didn't want to give that up. And that was the most common reason. The second, unfortunately, most common reason were what we labeled pragmatic reasons. And these were things like, well, they had a lot of money, or they had a car and they were capable of driving me to work. Then there were some other reasons like, well, we shared a social network. That is, we had friends together, and so we didn't want to make things awkward in that friendship group. Or we had children together, and we wanted to stay amiable. We wanted to stay friendly for the sake of the children. And then also one of the reasons that popped up was I wanted to continue to have sex with this person. So we identified these different reasons, and then we looked at some of the predictors, some of the things that predict whether you report that you've stayed friends with an ex for one of those particular reasons. And we examined 2 characteristics. One, whether a person reported being male or female. And then also these traits that are called dark personality traits. Very broadly, these refer to a person's willingness to exploit another person for personal gain. That is, are you willing to do something shitty to another person if it personally benefits you? So we found a couple of interesting findings here. One, that first off, men, unsurprisingly, perhaps are more willing to stay friends with an ex in order to continue to have sex with that person compared to women. Everyone was more likely to report staying friends with an ex for those reliability, sentimentality. They were there as a friend. They wanted to keep them as a friend. But in terms of these dark personality traits, so what happens is we can measure these traits using an inventory, and people score relatively higher or lower on that trait. That is, they're more willing to exploit other people for personal gain, or they're less willing. People who reported greater willingness to do that were more likely to report staying friends with an ex for those pragmatic reasons. That is, that person was simply useful to them. They had money, they could fix stuff, they could drive them places, and also, again, to have sex with their partner. So revealing some of the motivations behind why people stay friends with their ex-partners. Aside from looking at romantic relationships, part of romance is competition, is attraction, not just between people who are looking to get into a relationship, but often conflict among those who may be seeking a similar partner. And so I've looked at different types of conflict, fighting, and what happens after fights that you might observe. Now, if anyone's gone onto YouTube and you've just searched for street fights, you'll find tons on there. If you look up these videos, you'll see people who have recorded actual fights, usually between men, where they wail on one another. They get into these really deep, sometimes bloody fist fights. And then afterwards, they almost always engage in a particular behavior, shaking hands. This is something that you see after many different types of conflict. You'll see this in sporting events. What happens is you go out on the field, you play that game, and no matter who wins or who loses, one of the first things that coaches often encourage their players to do is go to the other team and shake their hand. Now, what this is described as is it's good sportsmanship, right? You're showing respect for the other team. But in terms of the function of that behavior, what it does is it makes it less likely that in the future, if, say, there are tensions left over from the conflict, you've got this lingering resentment towards one another, what shaking hands can do is it can make it less likely that will occur, that future conflict will occur in the future. That is, you want to stay on good terms with one another. So the reason that coaches often encourage good sportsmanship is it's not arbitrary. It's to make sure that in the future you stay on good terms with these people that you'll continue to have an interaction with. Now, this isn't something that you just see in humans. Non-human primates do this as well. I actually had the fortune to work in a primate lab several years ago, where I got to observe baboons. Baboons are these kind of very large primates, and they're very what's called sexually dimorphic. That is, the differences between males and females within the species is quite noticeable. And one of the big differences is that the males tend to be much larger, more muscular, and when housed with other males, they tend to get aggressive. They tend to get territorial. And what you can often see is if two males are within a shared enclosure, they'll often get into fights. It might be bloody. They might pull hair out from one another. They hit one another, and then they go their separate ways. But what you usually see afterwards is that over time, one of them will come up to the other and usually start to groom. That is, start to do that where they kind of run their fingers through their hand, through their hair, they pick out parasites, they do a favor, they do something that feels good for the other baboon, and then hopefully that baboon will reciprocate. And the idea there is these individuals will have to continue to interact across time. And so it would be a good thing to make up after that conflict, show them that they still respect them, that they still want to get along. So humans do this, non-human primates do this as well. I've also looked at what are called morphometric cues of mate quality. Now that's a lot, but morphometric just means that it has to do with the shape or the style of the body or the face. And these are cues of what are called mate quality, that is, characteristics that one would look for in a potential sexual or romantic partner. What I've done is I've published work looking at the relative importance of 3 different characteristics to people's perceptions of others' faces, that is, especially the faces of potential romantic or intimate partners. And we identified 3 traits that seem to be quite important. We compared the relative importance of 3 different traits. One, I've already mentioned this, something called sexual dimorphism. That is the degree to which a person's face looks prototypically male or female. There are certain traits that systematically differ between men's and women's faces. For example, men tend to have, I'll try to orient myself in the camera here, men tend to have relatively wider jawbones. That is, the distance from particularly this point to this point tends to be larger among men, and I should say very broadly, males within a species compared to females. This is true, again, of humans and non-humans as well. Men tend to have more facial hair. Men's eyebrows tend to be somewhat thicker than women's. Men's eyes tend to be slightly smaller than women's. Now, that is not to say that it's significantly so, but if you actually measure in terms of millimeters, men on average do tend to have smaller eyes. Women tend to have more prominent cheekbones. So that is the degree to which you can kind of detect whether see a person's cheekbones easily. Women are more likely to have that. And the idea is that many of these traits are actually controlled by or influenced by the amount of hormones that an individual is exposed to, both in utero, that is when they were much younger and in the womb, as well as during puberty, which can shape the development of these traits. So we looked at the degree to which people care about these sexually dimorphic cues, compared to also what are called what's called fluctuating asymmetry. That is the degree to which a person's face does not appear perfectly symmetrical. The logic here is that when a person's face is more symmetrical, so everyone's face, basically from very early on, is programmed to be fairly symmetrical. That is, DNA codes for what's called bilateral symmetry. And this is, again, true for humans. You'll see this among other species as well. Most species have this line that you can draw down the center of the body and fold one half over the other. That's bilateral symmetry. Now, the extent to which you remain symmetrical, though, is dependent on a number of factors, such as how often you've been sick throughout your life, whether you've had any developmental issues growing up, or what are called developmental perturbations, that is, disruption to development. So it's an indicator of generally a person's developmental health. That is, if you are more asymmetrical, you are less symmetrical, that may indicate that you have had a harder time either finding proper nutrition, fighting off disease, etc. And so that could be an underlying cue that one would look for in a potential romantic partner if, say, you were going to pair up with this person for a while, have children with them, and ultimately pass on those qualities to children. Also, color cues to health. And when I say color cues to health, I don't mean skin color tied to things like ethnicity, but rather various levels of pigments within the skin. Turns out there are 3 predominant pigments in a person's skin. There are red pigments that contribute to flushness of the skin. That is when a person blushes. That would be what's called skin blood perfusion. That is how much blood is perfused or distributed within the face at a given time. Also, yellow pigmentations. So yellow pigmentations contribute to, an easy way to think about this is how healthy or glowing a face tends to appear. So someone can be kind of more washed out looking. You'll see this when someone is sick. They tend to have kind of what's called a pallid look to their face. And so having more yellow hues to the skin, this yellow pigmentation, can actually contribute to perceptions of healthiness. And then there are also blue pigmentations, which we don't perceive very easily consciously, but they actually do contribute to our perception of a person's health. Though yellow and red pigmentation seems to be some of the most important for these assessing a potential romantic partner. So we looked at these different characteristics, compared them, And one of the interesting findings that we determined was that people really cared about these sexually dimorphic cues, the degree to which a person appears more male or female, compared to symmetry or color cues to health. And this might suggest that there's something about those underlying levels of hormone that which contribute to sexual dimorphism that are very consequential to people's choices in who they select as a partner, potential romantic partner. Going from there, where I've actually progressed in my research is I now study the intersection between morality and romantic relationships. Morality broadly referring to what we consider right or wrong. One of the earliest studies I looked at at that intersection, at that crossover, are looking at what are called May-December romances. This is kind of an old-timey term. If no one's heard this, I don't blame you, but May-December romances refer to those in which someone who is much older is paired up with someone who is much younger. So I think colloquial terms, things like, a gold digger, right? Someone who is a much younger woman who's pairing up with a much older man, or it's kind of strange that women seem to have the derogatory names for these age mismatched things, because you also hear the term a cougar, right? A much older woman with a much younger man. Well, people tend to morally disapprove of these kinds of relationships. That is, compared to an age-matched relationship, age-discrepant relationships, or these May-December romances, tend to be perceived more negatively. And there are a number of reasons that might be the case. One that we tested in this study is we thought that the degree to which a relationship is perceived as transactional, that is, that these two people are together because they are explicitly getting something from one another. That is, maybe much older men tend to have more social status, they tend to have more money, and so a man is going to have relatively more money when they're older, and men tend to seek women who are relatively younger. And so he may be expecting to get something like sex from a partner, versus a woman who's much younger who gets involved with a male who's much older might be interested in, say, his money or his support of her. So to the degree that the relationship is more transactional, people may judge these relationships as inappropriate, compared to these age match relationships where maybe you can be more certain that people are getting together because they have shared interests, because they have shared life goals and that they're the same stage of life. How we tested this was we looked at people's attitudes towards age-discrepant relationships compared to age-congruent ones, and we looked at the degree to which people's attitudes towards sex work or prostitution helped to explain attitudes towards these May-December romances. And in fact, that's what we found, is that people who were more likely to disapprove of sex work or prostitution were also more likely to disapprove of these of age discrepant relationships, that there was crossover in how that explained moral disapproval of these kinds of relationships. From there, where I've gone is I've started to look at the morality of a particular category of intimate relationship that is becoming more and more popular, called consensual non-monogamy. Those of you who have not heard of this, monogamy refers to romance, a pair bond between just two individuals. So that is, if you're finding a sexual or romantic partner, you're only establishing that relationship with one other person, and you're doing so exclusively. Consensual non-monogamy includes things like polyamory or swinging or open relationships, where partners agree that they can form these intimate attachments with other people outside of just that pair bond. Now, one of the interesting things about these relationships is these two tend to be relatively more stigmatized. They tend to be more disapproved of compared to monogamy. And yet, when you look at the scientific research on these relationships, they seem to be achieving comparable relationship quality to those who are in monogamous relationships. There seems to be this stigma against these relationships, which we don't quite understand. And so a lot of my current research is looking at the reasons for this stigma. Why do people tend to disapprove of consensually non-monogamous relationships? And in fact, I currently have a grant where I'm collecting data to address this question directly. So this is some of my work. Again, this is the work that I've published in peer-reviewed journals. I've had to collect this data, send it in, and people rip it apart, and it's a very arduous process, but ultimately a very rewarding one, because the ideal is that this is information that has been vetted, and so can be more likely to be trusted, or at least it's more rigorous in how it addresses information about romantic relationships, etc. Aside from all the professional stuff, I want to give you a few personal details about me. Just one thing: I'm a huge nerd. I love video games. I love playing video games. I like board games. For a long time, several years ago, unfortunately, I haven't found a lot of people to do this with, but I used to play Dungeons and Dragons with people. And I'll say, if you ever get the opportunity to play Dungeons and Dragons, I highly encourage it. If you are going through anything in your life, if you need to self-examine yourself, playing D&D and role-playing with other people will help you work through those issues. Don't know what I mean? Give it a try. You'll see. I would not consider myself a Redditor. However, of all the social media sites that exist, of the ones that I care to spend time on, I actually really enjoy Reddit. And the reason is, I think that it's populated by a number, I think it's, on average, I would guess that it's populated by people who are above average in intelligence. And I also just like the particular way in which social media is shared on the site. If you go to Facebook, if you go to Twitter, if you go to most other social media sites, what you have is the option where, if you are scrolling through your newsfeed and you see something that you really like, what you can do is you can simply react to it. You can like it, you can get angry, you can cry, you can laugh, etc. There's no option, though, to dislike something, to say, hey, I don't think this belongs here, or I don't really think this is really newsworthy, or something that I want, people should have popping up in their newsfeed. And so Reddit has that. And so whether you see something on Reddit is really a combined total of the upvotes and downvotes that it has received, which I think is just possibly a much more responsible way of consuming social media. We'll talk a little bit about social media in this class as we go on, and some of the benefits and risks of it. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so in a small town called Wind Gap. It's about an hour north of Philadelphia. I went to college at a place called Albright College in Reading. I got my master's at a place called Bucknell, which is in central Pennsylvania. And then I moved to Michigan for about 5 years. For 5 years. I moved to Michigan for about 5 years, that's where I got my PhD. I lived in Pontiac, which is about just northwest of Detroit. So I spent a lot of time in Detroit during those years. Something fun about me: I really hate dressing formally. What you'll see in these recorded videos is generally I'll try to look professional and put together, but I also might wear a black t-shirt. I think the most important thing, and this is my expectation for all my students, is you should be dressing comfortably when you are attempting to learn something. You want as few distractions as possible, and I think that it's important that you're relaxed, that you set aside time to really engage with the material, and you don't necessarily have to worry about how you look. I suppose that's a nice thing about taking an asynchronous online class. If you haven't picked this up already, I actually really enjoy public speaking. I enjoy it not because it is inherently enjoyable to me, but rather that I recognize it's a challenge and it's a puzzle. My puzzle is I have to say something in just the right way that it makes sense to the people that I'm talking to. I have to explain something in a way that really resonates with my audience. And sometimes I accomplish that, sometimes I don't. When I do, though, it's very rewarding. And so I think I've gotten okay at that. I think I've gotten pretty good at that. And so now I actually really enjoy public speaking. I've figured out that puzzle. If you're interested in what wavelength I'm at, typically I drink tea, caffeinated tea. I think that compared to coffee tends to make me too stimulated, overstimulated. My attention actually tends to wander more if I'm overstimulated by coffee compared to tea. Tea is nice, right in the center. Not sweet tea. I realize that's a big faux pas, but I actually find that I drink too much sugar if I drink sweet tea. So unsweetened, caffeinated tea is where I'm at currently. And if you have any troubles with caffeination or feeling tired, you might actually be drinking too much coffee. We'll talk about this when we get to the section on consciousness and drug use, but what happens is if you start drinking too much caffeine, you can become more tolerant to it. So one of the most effective ways to consume caffeine or really any kind of drug is to do so in moderation, such that you do not become physically dependent on it, in this case for stimulation. What I am not. So I have been teaching for more than 10 years at this point. I have a fair amount of experience in it, and of course I have an experience doing research. But what I'm not is, I mean, I kind of have gray hairs going on here. It's kind of hard to see now. What I'm not, though, is someone who's been teaching for decades and decades and decades and decades. And so there may be a lot of questions that you all have of me that I'm not going to address here, that I do not state clearly, or that I do not explain well. If that's the case, I actually encourage you to reach out to me. I'll go over where you can do that, how you can do that, the email address that you can send your questions to get my response. I respond very quickly, but I realize I don't know everything, and I realize that there are things that I would love to address if I could. So I think I'm humble enough to say that I don't know everything, and there's tons of wisdom that I'm lacking. However, what I am is someone who has had experience in psychology, in psychological research for quite some time now. So if any of you are thinking about graduate school, if any of you are thinking about how to apply a degree in psychology, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Give you some pointers about what directions you can take in your career. And of course, I think we'll have fun in this class. There's plenty of good content here. So that's the resource that I am to you. Before I can set you free to look at the first week's set of videos and begin class content, I need to give you a bit of a tutorial. So if you've never used Blackboard before, now if you're accessing this, you've already figured it out. But what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of a tour of Blackboard and how this class is going to be organized so that you have that for yourself. I also need to ask you to complete something called a student information sheet, which I will highlight when we go over Blackboard. And then I want to go over the syllabus and look at what a normal week is going to look like. So let me pull up Blackboard. So when you first log in, this is what you'll see. And you'll notice that it's pared down to precisely what you need. No more, no less. At the very top, there's a tab called What is Due. You should be checking this every single Thursday. This tells you, surprise, surprise, what is due. What I recommend is that you work through the items listed here in the order that they're listed. So first, watch the 2 lecture videos listed under recorded lectures, which will be over here. You're already watching the course introduction. Then after this, watch chapter 1, the history of psychology. After you watch the videos, I then recommend reading the textbook. I think that this does a much better job of framing what you read after you've watched about it in the video. Then move on to completing and submitting the Chapter 1 exam. And then for this week only, complete the student information sheet, which is located under a different tab called Syllabus and Course Docs, which I'll show you in a second. Now, there are other items that may be listed here. For example, you'll be expected to complete hypothesis assignments, research proposals, etc. So keep your eye on this tab throughout the semester. I've also listed the course schedule here. This is in your syllabus, but this tells you everything that we're going to be covering throughout the semester. So the topic of each week is listed below. All items listed under due over here must be submitted before 11:59 p.m. on that day. So be sure to check what is due, that tag that I just showed you on Blackboard. We have 4 units. Unit 1, we're going to be going over using the scientific method and how it especially is applied within the psychology to avoid what are called cognitive biases. We'll get into that soon. We'll then get into neurons, learning, and memory. We'll learn a lot about the biology of psychology. We'll move on to Unit 3 at the beginning of October, looking at various aspects of subjective experience, sensation and perception, consciousness, etc. And then near the end of the semester, we'll get into Unit 4, where we'll look at psychological development, as well as pathology. That is, what happens when something goes wrong with development or someone starts to experience distress because of the way that their mind may work. So peruse this at your leisure, look at the topics, just make sure to use this as a guideline for what you should be submitting each week. Of course, it's listed in what is due, but this will also give you at a brief glance what you need to submit on a particular day. Again, before 11:59 p.m. on that day that it's due. If you move down to syllabus and course docs, this is going to be, if you can't find something, look for it here. The syllabus is here, which I'll go over in a second. You can download. The textbook is free. It's open access. You do not need to buy it, and you can access it by clicking on this link right here. It's pretty simple. You download it, and you can download it to any device you wish. If you have any trouble with technology, there is a technology FAQ right here. This is something that the retention committee of USC Salkehatchie put together for students. So if you have difficulty with Blackboard, your USC account, or any other technology issue, make sure that you visit this. And of course, get in contact with the USC help desk at sadesk@mailbox.sc.edu. All that's listed in this document. The Opportunities Scholars Program, those of you who are not familiar with this or have not heard about this in your other classes, this is a program that offers individual tutoring and advisement workshops for helping with those who may be new to college or are unsure about the best practices for succeeding. They coordinate student activities and different cultural events. They grant access to computer labs and other resources. And for students who qualify, there are financial assistance grants available to you as well. If you want to learn anything more about OSP, you can visit this link right here. And if you wish to apply to join OSP, which you need to do to get access to many of these resources, you do it through these links here. Before next week, I want you to fill out this right here, the student information sheet. This just asks for basic information about you, your name, what your preferred name is, so that as we interact, I refer to you correctly, what your major is, what your interests are. This helps me to cater the information that I present in this class to the students that are in that class. So please fill that out before next week so I can get to know you a little bit better. In this class, there is a research participation requirement. All the information that you need is listed right here in this folder. There's a lot here. I recommend reading this handout, but very briefly, what you will need to do is by the end of the semester, you need to have participated in 2 online studies and 2 in-lab studies. Now, what is a study? Typically, if it's an online study, you might be asked to fill out survey questions. You might be asked to take about a 30-minute survey, asking questions about your demographic information, questions that may be relevant to whatever the researchers are examining within the study. For the in-lab assignments, what you'll have to do is go to one of the USC Salkehatchie campuses and participate in a lab studies put on by one of the psychology professors, Dr. Gottsman. So the online studies are listed here in this folder. You can click on this folder right here, and it'll take you to the links. It'll give you directions for completing them. They're very straightforward. You click on them, you read the directions, you do everything that it tells you. At the very end, you'll receive a code that you have to send to me to receive credit for participation. For the lab studies, it's a little bit more involved, but they usually take a little less time than the online studies, actually, once you're there doing them. To sign up for these lab studies, these are the links that you will use. These take you to Google Spreadsheets. What it'll look like is you go there, you sign up for a particular time slot. It'll give you instructions for where to show up, when to show up. You go there at that time. Someone will be there to greet you. They will run you through the study, which again usually takes, I want to say recently it's been 10 to 15 minutes at most. You then get credit for it, and I will be updated by Dr. Gottsman about who has participated. So check these links out, and if you have any questions or there's anything that's confusing or you're not sure where to go, you can contact Dr. Gottsman directly at this email address. Now, no one can coerce you to participate in research, so if for any reason you do not wish to participate in the online or in-lab studies, there are alternative assignments available. The instructions are written out right here, but in short, you'll be asked to read a peer-reviewed published article and then summarize it and provide a critique of it in a 2-page paper. Now, I'll be honest, this usually takes a bit longer than actually participating in the research. So this is a choice that you can make for yourself. I will certainly not push you one way or another. But by the end of the semester, again, you need 2 online studies, 2 in-lab studies, and those are due before the comprehensive exam is due. Moving on, back to syllabus and course docs. There's a folder for optional readings right here. These are readings that I will mention throughout lecture. You will not be required to read them, but if you're interested in learning more about them, I will post them here. And then there are several worksheets that you will need throughout the semester. You can access them in this folder as well. For example, when we go into the learning chapter, there will be several worksheets to practice classical and operant conditioning. You can access those as well. Moving on to recorded lectures. Each of the lectures that you need to view each week are posted right here. So you're already watching the course introduction. Chapter 1, the history of psychology, is also listed here. This will update every Thursday with new lectures. For hypotheses and proposals, you will have to complete hypothesis assignments and write research proposal papers. In total, you will write 6 hypotheses, and you will write 2 research proposals in which you will expand upon those hypotheses. I'm going to go over this in just a second, so I'm just going to mention for right now that this is here. When you start to write proposals, which are a little bit more involved, I've actually uploaded some advice. I will be going over it in a PowerPoint, one of the PowerPoints in the future. But I've taken those tips and I've uploaded them right here for easy access when you finally do have to write those proposals. And when you need to submit your assignments, your hypotheses, or research proposals, the submission links are in this folder here. These are where the exams will appear. So Chapter 1 exam is already available. After you watch that first video, then go in, click on this link, access the exam, submit your responses, and I will have access to those responses. I will post grades before the following week. So it may, seeing what grade you received may be delayed by up to a week, but I typically try to get these posted ASAP. And then if you're interested in what your grade is, hopefully you are, you can check your grades out here. And later in the semester, when you need to submit course evaluations, you'll find you'll be able to submit these here. So that's Blackboard. Again, it's pretty straightforward. I think this is pared down to precisely what you need. What I want to do now is I want to go to the syllabus. So if you were to go back to syllabus and course docs, download the syllabus and look at it, this is what you'd be looking at. This is, in short, your contract with me. This tells you everything you need to know about my expectations of you throughout this class. So let's just go through this. Again, this is Psych 101. That's fall 2022. I am Justin Mogilski. If you need to get in contact with me, please send me an email. I'm quite responsive to email. It's honestly the best way to get hold of me. However, if we cannot resolve something through email, I do encourage you to contact me about scheduling an appointment that we can meet. This would be done online. We can do it through something called Blackboard Collaborate. So if for any reason you wish to meet and speak, I'm happy to do so. I really like helping out, so please do not hesitate to use me as a resource. Here's the course description. Read through that at your leisure. Again, this is the text. It is open access, meaning you don't have to pay for it. And the outcomes and objectives, course objectives, you can read through on your own time. What I want to draw your attention to is how grades are determined. So 10% of the grade is going to be participation, and this is credit that you earn simply by watching the recorded lecture videos uploaded to Blackboard. I have a way of seeing who has accessed them and who has consistently been turning in assignments. So if you stay up on everything, if you show me that you are participating, you'll get that credit. You'll have to complete several exams throughout the semester. I noted these in the course schedule. I will also note them below when we go over the course schedule, which is also on the syllabus. But each chapter will conclude with an exam. Some chapters have 2 exams, depending on how much content is in them. In total, the exams are worth 40% of the course grade. They'll be administered online. They'll be due 1 week from when they're available. And all the exams are going to be multiple choice. At the end of the semester, there's going to be a comprehensive final exam worth 20% of your course grade. This exam contains multiple choice questions, all multiple choice, about content, though, from any chapter that we've covered throughout the semester. If you hate comprehensive exams, don't worry about it. Before the comprehensive exam comes around, I'm going to prepare you very well for what content is likely to be on there. So you'll have to... Even though you've perhaps completed an exam, you've completed a chapter, don't tune it out entirely. You will have to hold on to some of that information for the comprehensive exam. But like I said, I will prepare you for it. And it'll be made available 1 week before the scheduled final exam testing period, so you'll have that time to study and complete it. You'll be asked to complete those hypothesis assignments. I'll go over those in a second. Those will be worth 10% of your overall course grade. Each assignment will be a short 1-paragraph description of a research hypothesis that you would like to test. Again, more in a moment. And then research proposals will be worth 20% of the course grade, and there will be 2 throughout the semester, and each proposal will be a concise 2-page double-spaced paper for which you will elaborate one of your hypotheses. And then finally, there is extra credit, and it's worth potentially up to 5%. How you get this is by participating in extra research. So you have to participate in 4 studies as a requirement. But if you do research participation above and beyond, you will earn 1 extra percentage point on your final grade for each additional credit that you earn. But depending on what's available for that semester, you may not get up to 5%, and you cannot go beyond 5%. So keep your eyes open for that. And then if you're interested in how grades are calculated, it is described here. In Blackboard, that's where I will post grades. Everything automatically calculates, though there are certain grades that may not show correctly if, for example, I have not yet entered that grade. So if the grade is not entered, it's not going to be factored into your final grade yet. So please be aware of that. Otherwise, your grade is automatically calculated in Blackboard. My class expectations, you're gonna have to use Blackboard. I think I've hit that point home pretty well. Where do you start? I've already described this, but beginning of each week, I post the coursework due next week in Blackboard. You access it in that first tag, what is due. You'll be expected to complete the assigned readings, assignments, recorded lectures, online exams before the due date. And please be sure to check your email frequently. And if you are not in the habit of checking your USC email, please link your USC email to whichever email account you do use. Make sure that if I need to get in contact with you, that I am getting in contact with you. And then please send me an email if you expect to be unable to complete assignments by their due dates. I am, of course, always willing to move and flex with people as they need. I've already mentioned the research participation requirement. You're required to participate in that research. The requirement should be completed before the final exam due date. If you do not complete the requirement by this date, your grade will drop a full letter grade. So make sure that you get that done before the end of the semester. All right, the course schedule, it'll be below. Academic conduct, this is pretty boilerplate. Make sure you conduct yourself in a manner that promotes academic integrity and respect for the educational process and the safety and well-being of all members of the community. The big thing that you are likely to violate, if anything, is plagiarism. Plagiarism is passing off another person's work as your own. Please do not do this. As you write your proposals, do not use content from other assignments that you've turned in other classes or that you found off of the internet. I have ways of checking for this. Don't put yourself in that situation. If I see plagiarism, I am required to report it, and there are some very harsh penalties for it, including expulsion. So please conduct yourself academically. If you need to add or drop classes, the registrar's page is here, and then the information that you need for doing that is available. And then if you need any kind of accommodation through Disability Support Services, DSS, you can find information about that here. And then, like I said, at the very bottom here, I've repasted well, originally, this is where the course schedule is, but this is what I went over on Blackboard. So it tells you what is happening each week and what is due and what you need to read. And then at the very bottom, I give the grading scale. Pretty straightforward. All right. I also would like to go over this research hypotheses and proposals outline. Again, this is uploaded to Blackboard. It is underneath hypotheses and research proposals, that tag in Blackboard. I want to read this introductory paragraph, and then I want to just kind of open this document and let you peruse it at your own time to understand how these assignments are going to go. I will be covering in more detail what you need to do for these hypothesis assignments in the Chapter 2 introduction. But here's what I'd like to read. So humans form beliefs about what is true and what is not. We form these beliefs by observing the world, detecting associations, and using this knowledge to make decisions. Now, brains are well designed to detect and record patterns, but sometimes we detect and record patterns that aren't real. We believe things that seem true, but are not. To overcome this problem, we have developed the scientific method, a procedure for assessing a belief's veracity, its truthfulness. For this class, you will practice using the scientific method to examine several beliefs that you have about the human mind and the behavior it produces. Over the course of the semester, you will write 4 scientific psychological research hypotheses and 2 research proposals. A research hypothesis is a tentative statement or prediction about the relationship between 2 things, or what I will be calling variables, an independent and a dependent variable. For example, you may believe that a person's political beliefs, such as being Republican, Democrat, or Independent, is somehow related to their willingness to wear a mask during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, though this answer to the question might seem obvious to you, you can't be certain that your belief is true without evidence. So each research proposal will be an opportunity to take one of your hypotheses, these things that you predict that you believe are true, and then design an experiment to test it. Descriptions for each assignment begin on the next page. Please be mindful of the due dates, which appear on that course schedule, and each assignment should be submitted in Blackboard. Make sure that you follow these formatting guidelines for submission, and then as you go to complete these assignments, read through the outline for each. So there's a hypothesis outline, which tells you how to do the hypotheses, and then separately there's the research proposal outline. Read through this. If you have questions after seeing the Chapter 2 introductory video, please contact me, and of course I am happy to meet and help you with these assignments. All right, so that's that. Again, back to our PowerPoint. I think we've gone just about over everything that you need to do, that need to know to succeed in this class. A few other bits of information. As you watch the other recorded lectures, I want to note how I organize my slides, because this will help you organize your notes for studying later. At the very top of every slide, you're going to see a section header. And this is a header that's going to be there for as long as we are talking about that particular topic. So in the first lecture, we're going to talk about history. I will have several slides dedicated to simply presenting different aspects of history. Underneath that, the first bullet point will be a major idea or topic. Then anything that is indented underneath that particular heading is going to belong within that heading. So for example, we'll talk about psychoanalysis and Freud. Those 2 points, that Freud is known for a lot of things, the unconscious and early life experiences, each of those belongs under psychoanalysis. Likewise, when it says processes in the mind which occur automatically, or thought processes, memories, interests, and motivations, those belong underneath unconscious. So each of those are describing unconscious. So you should be, as you're taking notes for this class, which you should do, As you're taking notes for this class to study later, I recommend organizing your notes in this way. Also, I'll be using examples a lot. What I'll do is I will give you a definition of something, I'll explain it a little bit, and then I will usually relate it to something that you already know or something that is much more, that is not technical. When I mention these examples, write them down. They will not usually appear on the slides, so make a note of them so that later when you're looking at your notes, you go, geez, psychoanalysis, what was that? And then you see that you wrote down an example that I gave, and you can say, yes, of course, I remember that example. That helps me remember what psychoanalysis is. So organize your notes in this way, write down the examples that I use. All right, so what are we going to cover in this class? We're going to talk about some pretty difficult subjects. I want to warn everyone of that. We're going to talk about psychological disorders later in the class. We'll talk about drug use and abuse. We'll talk about sexuality simply because this is my area of research and I think extensively about relationships, sexuality, etc. We'll talk about consciousness, what it means to be a conscious organism. And related to that, we'll talk a little bit about whether humans have free will or not, whether we are in many ways like a squishy computer. What features of our nervous system and the way that our brain and our nervous system works, how does that mirror what a computer does? What are the similarities? And of course, what are the differences? Because we are not just computers, but we do share a lot of features with them. Before we can get to this really juicy stuff, though, we gotta go over the basics. And that makes it sound like this isn't juicy. It is. What I want to do in the first chapter is go over how psychology is a science and why it needs to be a science. What does it mean for something to be a scientific study of the mind relative to other styles of knowing or generating knowledge? We need to start there, and that's going to be where we take off. So again, that's all for the introduction. Move on to the next set of videos, and if you have questions, of course, contact me. Thanks, everybody.